Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at a short grammar lesson on third person personal pronouns, okay? So before we start, this might sound a little bit familiar. It's because we've already done a video on personal pronouns where we looked at first and second person. So in other words, how you say I, you, we, and you all. And you might remember if you watched that video, I told you I'd make a second on third person pronouns because they are slightly different and a little bit trickier to understand. So we're going to give them their own video. But if you haven't watched the first video on first and second person pronouns, go watch it. That way you can get sort of an understanding of all the different persons, right? I, you, he, she, it, we, you, all, and they when it comes to personal pronouns, right? So that would be a helpful place to start. So the first question we want to ask when we dive in is, what is a pronoun? And again, if you watched the other video, you've heard me ask this, but it's important to make sure you understand pronouns replace nouns. So you can say things like I'm happy, you are sad, we are happy, whatever it is you want to say, okay? So in English and in Latin, pronouns are just taking the place of a noun. It's pretty straightforward. So if you said, I see the boy is happy, you want to avoid the repetition and use a pronoun to replace the repeated word. So in other words, instead of saying, I see the boy is happy, pronouns let you say, I see the boy, he is happy. Right? We're avoiding repeating ourselves. That word he, and actually I as well, those are personal pronouns, right? They're referring back to a person or a thing, right? And it's kind of avoiding that repetition. So they're very useful to use. So what do we mean by personal? Well, again, this might be the second time you've heard it, but it's good to review. The person of a pronoun is similar to when we talk about persons for verbs, right? In English and Latin, we use the terms first, second, and third person when we're talking about pronouns, okay? A first person pronoun is referring to the speaker. So in other words, I and we. If it's the speaker by themselves, first person singular, we would use the term I, right? The pronoun I. If the speaker is part of a group, you would use the pronoun we, right? That's the plural version. For second person pronouns, it's referring to someone the speaker is talking to, right? So if you're having a conversation with someone, you would either say you or you all, depending on if you're talking to one person, you, or more than one person, you all. That's it. So third person pronouns, which is what we're really focusing on in this video, are when you're referring to the person or subject or object rather being spoken about. So in other words, you're not talking to this person, right? And you aren't this person. It's a third person, literally a third person in the conversation who's not necessarily there. Okay. So in English, you'd use the words he, she, it, or they, depending on how many people or objects the speaker is talking about. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense, but the real question is, how do we use them, right? What are these really used for in English and in Latin? Well, to understand this, a key word you want to make sure that you have a good understanding of is the term antecedent, right? So like we've been saying before, pronouns replace nouns, right? The word being replaced by the pronoun is called the antecedent. It literally means the word that came before it, okay? So you want to make sure that you feel really comfortable using that term and you understand what it means. Again, the antecedent is the word that's being replaced by the pronoun, right? So here's some example of third person pronouns and how they replace antecedents, okay? So if you said, I see Julia, she is happy. She is a third person singular pronoun. The antecedent, the thing that I'm replacing or referring to, is Julia. Right? So that's how they're connected. Julia and she are the same person. We would call Julia the antecedent. She is the personal pronoun. Here's another example. You could say, I see Cornelius and Gaius. Do they see me? Right? They is a third person plural pronoun. The antecedent is Cornelius and Gaius. Those are the two people I'm referring to when I say they. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense. And again, this might be the second time you've kind of heard that description if you watched the other video, but it's always good to review and just make sure that you feel really comfortable with these terms before we move forward. So now the question is, how do we use them in Latin, right? Maybe you understand the English, but what goes on in Latin? So this is what it looks like, okay, what you need to know. All pronouns in Latin have case and number. We said that in our previous video. Okay, and it depends on how you use them, right? So they could have a different case, but the number, right, is just if it's singular or plural, and the case is if it's a subject or direct object or however you're using it. Okay, so third person pronouns also have gender, and this is the key difference from first and second person pronouns. So you want to remember, first and second person pronouns do not have gender. So if I use the term I or we or you all, you have no idea the gender of the person or thing that I'm talking about. That's different than using a third person pronoun, where in English we do designate a gender by using the terms he, she, it, right? Those have gender. The one odd thing is in English, the word they does not have gender, right? So in English it doesn't, but in Latin it does. So this is where you start to see differences between Latin and English and the different types of pronouns. So the key idea is third person pronouns will always have gender. Okay, so that might sound a bit confusing. You might be wondering, like, what are we talking about? There's a lot of grammar. I get it. Let's boil it down into a chart just so you can see it. Okay, the chart looks like this. And if you really wanted to memorize it, feel free, go ahead. But I think it's better to kind of keep this chart in your back pocket or your notes and refer to it whenever you run into a pronoun in Latin, which happens all the time. Okay, and you'll kind of learn this by accident. But here's our chart of third person pronouns. You have to have different columns because now we have gender. So we have a masculine, a feminine, and a neuter column. Okay, but otherwise, you still have singular and plural, you still have the cases, but there is a difference between the gender, and that's the only really tricky part of third person pronouns. So for masculine, we go is, eus, eam, eo, right? For feminine, it's ea, eus, eam, ea, and for neuter, it's id, eus, ed, eo. Okay, so the singulars go is, ea, id. That's kind of how we refer to them because they're nominative singulars going masculine, feminine, and neuter are is, ea, id. So they are similar in some respects. So like some patterns you can see is in genitive singular, for instance, right? Eus means of him or his. It can also mean of her when it's feminine or hers. And it can also mean of it or its when it's neuter, okay? So there are times where in Latin, you're not going to be able to really figure out the gender just by looking at a word. And we'll show some examples of how you can make this work and understand it. The same thing happens with the dative singular. So a, it either means to or for him, her, or it. Okay, and the context of the sentence will always help you with this. When you get to the plural, you have ai, ea, right? If you're going left to right, masculine, feminine, and neuter. So this is where it gets a little easier because you're using the endings, right? The same as first and second declension noun endings. So in other words, for masculine, you just put an E and then you add E orem e sos is. For feminine, it's E followed by I orem is as is. And for neuter, it's an E followed by A orem is a is, right? These are the endings we know. So in the plural, it's actually a little bit easier to kind of track this pattern and use it. But I want you to focus in really quickly on those third person plural pronouns, okay? Because this is where it's different than English. So in English, all of these are translated them or they, all right? But in Latin, there is a difference between masculine, feminine, and neuter, and that's what you want to pick up here. Ei would mean they if it's all men, ai would be they if it's all women, and eo would be they if you're referring to objects, basically, right? Neuter objects. So hopefully that's not too overwhelming, okay? Because when you look at that chart, you can be asking yourself, which one am I supposed to pick? What am I supposed to do? Okay, and there's actually a pretty simple sort of pattern or steps you can follow to figure this out. And it goes like this. Whenever you want to use a Latin pronoun, first you find your antecedent, right? The word you're replacing. You can figure out the person and number of your pronoun based on your antecedent, okay? So you can tell right away if it's a first, second, or third person pronoun, and if it's singular or plural. Now, if you're using a third person pronoun, which is what we're covering in this video, the antecedent will also give you the gender. So in other words, if I'm referring to or replacing a feminine word, I need to use a feminine pronoun. If I'm replacing a masculine word, I need to use a masculine pronoun. And if I'm replacing a neuter word, I need to use a neuter pronoun. It all kind of makes sense. You do need to match the gender when you're dealing with third person pronouns. Now, for any pronoun you run into, first, second, third, doesn't matter. The case is always its own sort of independent thing. The case of the pronoun is based on its function in the sentence, right? So it has nothing to do with the antecedent. It depends on what that pronoun is doing on its own. Okay, so let's look at an example. If you saw the sentence Gaius and Lyca are walking, they are angry. Okay, and you wanted to put this into Latin, they is your third person pronoun. Okay, you look back at Gaius and Lyca, that's the antecedent, that's the two people I'm replacing. They is a third person plural pronoun. Okay, now since it's third person, I need the gender. Gaius and Lyca are both men, so they is going to be masculine in this sentence. Okay, now I have the person, third person, I have the number, plural, and I have the gender, masculine. I got all that from the antecedent. The last thing I need is the case. What is the word they doing in its own sentence? Well, when you're saying they are angry, they is the subject. So I have to look for a third person pronoun, masculine, nominative, plural. It's going to be a, right? E with the long I. So it would look like this. If I wanted to put this into Latin, they are angry, it would be ei irati sunt. Okay, it's masculine, it's third person plural, right? And nominative plural. That's how you can figure out what pronoun to use. And it also helps you the reverse too. If you're translating, it'll help you understand why you're seeing certain pronouns when you're reading Latin. Okay? So hopefully that makes some sense. I'm not feeling too overwhelmed, hopefully. But now I think it would be good to do some examples like we always do. All right, let's see it in action. And I'm going to pull some lines from the Road to Latin textbook. This gets covered in chapter 32. So let's just take a quick look together and we'll see these pronouns in action as we go through the sentences. So here's the first one. We have is lupam quae in palatio habitabat ad pueros mise. Okay, my pronoun is is. Now, if I look at is masculine, nominative, singular, right? It's going to mean he because of the gender. So that's how I know to translate it he. In this case, in the story, it was referring back to the god Mars, right? So the antecedent Mars is masculine, singular. So that's what you're referring to here. So I would translate it, he sent a she-wolf who was living on the Palatine Hill to the boys, right? Is our third person, singular, nominative pronoun, okay? That's how I know to translate it as he. Here's another one. Etiam tum Amulius fratrem et eius liberos timeba. So even then, Amulius feared his brother, fratrem, his is implied, and eius liberos, his children. Eius is the genitive singular form of the third person pronoun. Okay, so how did I know it was his? Well, it's because the antecedent here is Amulius. So if I were to look at that third person pronoun chart, you would see that eius is the genitive singular form for masculine, feminine, and neuter. So who am I talking to? But because in the context of the sentence, I'm referring to Amulius, who is a man, that's how I know it's his children. Okay, so it's saying Amulius was fearing his children, or sorry, it's not Amulius, rather, it's Numitor who it's referring to. So in the story, Amulius is fearing the children of Numitor, but the same idea applies. You're still talking about a man, it's still genitive singular, it's going to be his. Okay, so you have to kind of use the context clues and look back and say, where's my antecedent to figure this out? If you were to look in the Road to Latin textbook, you'd see that eius is referring to Numitor. Okay, so that's how you do it. Here's another example. You have ea tamen a Marte deo belli amabator. So she, however, was loved by Mars, the god of war. Ea here is a distinct form of the pronoun. It's third person singular, feminine, nominative. So it's going to mean she. Ea means she here, right? It's the subject. So it's referring back to the mother of Romulus and Remus, Rhea Silvia. So she was loved by Mars, right? Ea is a pretty distinct form of the pronoun. You can always tell what's going on. But if you were to look back or look at the chart, you'd see that this all lines up. Here's another one. Io proxima ei sub palatio era arbor antiquo. So near to it, ei here is dative. You have a special adjective, proxima, it goes with the dative. Okay, so this is referring back to the Palatine Hill, right? And where Romulus and Remus wash up. So you're saying near to it, at the foot of the Palatine Hill, there was an old tree, right? The a is to it here. It's referring back in the story, right, to a neuter word. And again, a is just dative singular. Let's do one more. You have tum pastor, cuius nomen erat Faustulus eos invenit. So you have then a shepherd whose name was Faustulus, found them, invenit eos. Eos there is our pronoun, right? It's plural, it's accusative, and it's masculine. You can tell by the os ending. So even though I don't know exactly who they are in just looking at the sentence, I would still know that the them that I'm referring to, the eos, are men or boys. We're not entirely sure, but you could tell, again, if you were to look at the story from chapter 32 of Road to Latin, it's referring to Romulus and Remus. So the antecedent is the two boys. That's why I chose eos, right? Then, if I was referring to two women or two girls, I'd have to switch it to eos, okay? So this is where in Latin, sometimes it's easier to understand what's going on than in English because the gender is there. It helps kind of narrow down who you're talking about. Okay, so if you want to practice this more, I would always recommend that you read or practice it through doing Latin, right, as much as you can. Magistrula is always a good way to go. So just a pro tip, go to Magistrula. You can set it up to give you a bunch of third-person pronouns. And it will rattle off as many sentences as you can possibly handle just to get the practice on it. If you want to use my Nova Latin textbook, if you were to go to chapter 32 of the Road to Latin textbook, I have some set up to let you practice this. But anyway, wherever you want to do it, use Magistrula. It's always an easy way to get a lot of repetition. But I would say practice through the context of sentences or real Latin. So don't just memorize the chart. You can do that, but it's so much better to actually read Latin and let the pronouns come at you, right? And you translate them through the context of a story or a sentence. That's a much better way to do it. Okay, so always just practice. And the more you do it, the easier this will become. So just to recap what we did in this video, you want to remember that pronouns replace nouns, right? We're trying to avoid that repetition. The noun being replaced is called the antecedent. And when we're dealing with third person pronouns, we're using in English the words he, she, it, or they. The way you can tell is from gender. Third person pronouns do have gender, okay? So there is a difference between he, she, and it, and even the different forms of they have gender, okay? That makes them stand out and different from first and second person pronouns, right? So when you're trying to figure it out, the antecedent will tell you the person, the number, and the gender of your third person pronoun, okay? But only when you're dealing with third person. But the antecedent tells you the gender. The case of the pronoun, as always, is determined on what it's doing in the sentence. What is its function in its own part of the sentence? That holds true for any pronoun you use. Okay, so if you follow these rules and practice it, you shouldn't have too big of a problem with pronouns. I know it can feel a little overwhelming at the start, right? But the more you practice it, it makes a lot of sense, and you should get pretty